Jake Morrison adjusted his formal diplomatic jacket as the massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber slowly opened before him. The sound echoed through the enormous space like thunder rolling across distant mountains. He had dreamed of this moment for years, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of standing in the most important room in the known galaxy. The chamber stretched out like a vast amphitheater carved from what looked like living crystal. 12 different species sat in their designated sections, each area designed to accommodate their unique physical needs. The air shimmered with translation fields and environmental controls that kept everyone comfortable despite their wildly different biological requirements. Jake walked down the central aisle with measured steps. His footsteps seemed incredibly loud in the hushed atmosphere. Representatives from worlds he had only read about in classified files now watched him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. This was humanity's first official appearance before the Galactic Council, and Jake knew that everything he said and did would determine whether his species would be welcomed or rejected. The Xanthari delegation occupied the largest section of the chamber. Their crystalline forms caught and refracted the ambient light into rainbow patterns that danced across the walls. Elder Xanthara, their leader, stood nearly 3 meters tall with a body that looked like it had been carved from living diamond. The elder's voice resonated through the translation system with the sound of wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "We welcome the representative of the species known as humans," Elder Xanthara said. "Your people have expanded rapidly across 17 star systems in what we consider a brief period. This expansion concerns many members of our community." Jake reached the speaker's podium and looked up at the assembled representatives. The Kelfari floated in their environmental suits filled with the methane atmosphere they needed to survive. Their tentacles moved in graceful patterns as they communicated through chemical signals that the translation system converted to speech. The insectoid Vex clicked and buzzed in their own section, their compound eyes tracking Jake's every movement with mechanical precision. "Honored members of the Council," Jake began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Humanity seeks only peaceful coexistence with all species. Our expansion has been driven by curiosity and the need to find new homes for our growing population. We have established colonies but have avoided any systems already claimed by other species." The Vex representative, a creature that looked like a praying mantis crossed with a computer, made a series of rapid clicks. The translation came through as precise mathematical calculations. Human expansion rate exceeds optimal colonization patterns by 37.4%. This suggests military rather than civilian objectives. Jake felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead but kept his voice calm. "Our expansion reflects human nature. We are explorers by instinct. When we see new frontiers, we feel compelled to investigate them. This has been true throughout our history on our home world and continues as we reach for the stars." Elder Xanthara's crystalline form shifted slightly, creating new patterns of reflected light. "The concern is not exploration but integration. Previous species have required centuries to adapt to galactic protocols. Humans seem to believe they can establish their own rules." Before Jake could respond, the chamber's energy barriers flickered and sparked. Emergency alarms began wailing as something enormous crashed through the supposedly impenetrable defenses. Debris showered down from the ceiling as a massive warship forced its way into the Council chamber's airspace. The ship was unlike anything in the Council fleet. Dark metal hull plates covered with weapon ports and sensor arrays created a silhouette that spoke of violence and conquest. Smaller fighter craft poured from launch bays like angry insects defending their hive. The Council members began fleeing toward emergency exits as armed figures in combat armor teleported directly into the chamber. Jake recognized them immediately from intelligence briefings. The Deari were one of the most feared species in this region of the galaxy. They stood over 2 meters tall with bodies that combined the worst features of sharks and machines. Cybernetic implants replaced much of their natural biology, making them perfect weapons of war. Their leader stepped forward. With movements that spoke of barely controlled violence, Overlord Krex removed his helmet to reveal a face that nightmares were made of. Rows of razor-sharp teeth filled a mouth that seemed to take up half his head. His eyes glowed with artificial light from the combat enhancement systems built into his skull. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had conquered worlds and enslaved entire civilizations. "Council members," Krex announced, his words cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Your time of weakness ends today. The Deari Empire claims this station and all territories controlled by your pathetic alliance. You will serve us or you will die." The remaining council members huddled together in terror. Jake had read reports about Deari tactics, but seeing them in person was entirely different. These were predators who had turned conquest into an art form. They had destroyed 47 different civilizations and enslaved the survivors. No species had ever successfully resisted them for more than a few months. Elder Xanthara's crystalline form was flickering with what Jake recognized as extreme distress. The Xanthari had maintained peace through diplomacy for thousands of years. They had no experience dealing with pure aggression like this. The Kelfari were releasing fear pheromones so strong that the environmental systems struggled to filter them out. Krex walked directly toward Jake, his heavy footsteps crushing fragments of debris that littered the floor. The human ambassador stood alone at the speaker's podium while armed Deari warriors surrounded him on all sides. Their weapons were aimed at his chest, but Jake made no move to run or hide. "Human," Krex said, his voice filled with contempt. "Your species is new here, but you will learn quickly. Surrender now, and your people will be allowed to serve the Empire. Resist, and we will turn your worlds into lifeless rocks. This is not a negotiation. This is your only chance to avoid extinction." The chamber fell completely silent except for the hum of damaged equipment and the distant sound of energy weapons firing as Deari forces secured the rest of the station. Council members who had spent centuries debating complex diplomatic solutions watched as their entire civilization teetered on the edge of collapse. Jake looked up at the towering alien warrior who could crush him with one hand. He thought about Earth and the colonies that depended on him to make the right choice. He considered his wife and children waiting for news of the diplomatic mission that was supposed to secure humanity's future among the stars. Then Jake Morrison spoke the word that would echo across the galaxy and change the course of history forever. No. Admiral Lisa Carter stood in the command center of Earth's orbital defense platform when the emergency signal arrived from Nexus Prime. The holographic display showed Jake Morrison's face streaked with blood as explosions rocked the background behind him. His message was brief but clear enough to send chills down her spine. "Admiral, the Deari have declared war on humanity. They are moving against our colonies immediately." Jake Morrison sending final diplomatic report. Earth must prepare for total war. Lisa had been waiting for this call ever since humans made first contact with alien civilizations 3 years ago. Every military strategist on Earth knew that peaceful coexistence was the best possible outcome, but also the least likely one. The galaxy was full of predators and humanity was still considered prey by most species that mattered. She activated Protocol 7 with a simple voice command that had been programmed into every human military system across 17 star systems. The response was immediate and devastating. What looked like peaceful cargo ships suddenly opened hidden weapon bays. Mining stations revealed defensive turrets that had been disguised as industrial equipment. Even luxury cruise liners activated combat systems that most passengers never knew existed. The alien species had made a critical error in judgment about human nature. They saw the rapid expansion and peaceful colonization efforts and assumed humanity was weak. What they failed to understand was that humans had been preparing for war from the moment they realized they were not alone in the universe. Captain Dan Riley received the activation signal while sitting in his office on New Boston Colony. He had been reviewing crop reports and mining quotas like any other day when every screen in the building suddenly switched to military command channels. The transformation was immediate and total. New Boston looked like a typical frontier settlement, with about 50,000 colonists spread across farming communities and mining operations. The buildings were simple and functional, with none of the advanced architecture found on Earth's major cities. Children played in streets that were still made of packed dirt rather than synthetic materials, but appearances were carefully designed to deceive potential enemies. Every building had been constructed with hidden defensive positions. The farming equipment could be converted to weapons in minutes. Even the children had been trained in emergency procedures that would make them valuable assets rather than helpless victims. Dan walked through the town square as colonists began implementing defensive measures they had practiced hundreds of times. Store owners closed their shops and headed for predetermined positions. Farmers drove their equipment toward defensive lines that seemed to appear from nowhere. Within 2 hours, the sleepy farming community had transformed into a military fortress. The Deari fleet arrived exactly when intelligence reports predicted they would. 50 warships dropped out of hyperspace in formation, designed to intimidate civilian populations into immediate surrender. Their massive hulls blocked out the sun as they moved into bombardment positions above the colony. Commander Vera Stone watched the enemy fleet through underground observation posts that the Deari scanners could not detect. She commanded 300 colonial marines who had been disguised as civilian workers and technicians. Her mission was simple but almost impossible. Make the aliens pay for every meter of ground they tried to take. The Deari broadcast their surrender demand using the same message they had transmitted to 47 other worlds. The translation was perfect and the meaning was clear. Submit or die, no negotiation, no compromise. Total surrender or total destruction. Don Riley stood in the town square with a microphone that would broadcast his response to the alien fleet. Behind him stood colonists who had transformed from farmers and miners into soldiers in a matter of hours. Children had been moved to secure bunkers, but adults remained at their posts with weapons that had been hidden throughout the community. Deari fleet, Dan said into the microphone, his voice steady despite the overwhelming odds. This is Captain Daniel Riley speaking for New Boston Colony. We have received your surrender demand and our answer is the same one given by Ambassador Morrison on Nexus Prime. No, we will not surrender. We will not submit. Come and take what you can. The bombardment began immediately. Energy beams lanced down from orbit to strike buildings that exploded in flames and debris. The Deari expected the attack to break human resistance within minutes, like it had on every other world they conquered. Instead, they discovered that humans had prepared for exactly this scenario. Underground bunkers protected most of the civilian population, while hidden defensive systems returned fire with weapons that should not have existed on a farming colony. Surface buildings were designed to collapse in ways that created defensive barriers rather than simply burning. Even the destruction was part of the human plan. Deari ground troops landed in the ruins expecting to find a broken enemy ready to surrender. What they found instead were humans who used every piece of debris as cover for continued resistance. Fighters emerged from hidden tunnels to attack from directions the aliens never expected. Every street became a battleground. Vera Stone led her Marines through underground passages that connected every major building in the colony. The tunnels had been dug during construction and disguised as utility systems. Now they allowed defenders to move unseen and strike enemy forces from behind. The urban warfare was unlike anything the Deari had experienced before. Most species surrendered when faced with superior firepower. Humans seemed to fight harder when the odds were against them. Every building that fell revealed another layer of defenses. Every victory cost the attackers more than they expected to pay. Hours passed with fighting that turned streets into rubble and buildings into fortresses. The Deari controlled most of the surface, but humans continued to resist from basements and tunnels and hidden positions that seemed to exist everywhere. The aliens found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to accept defeat even when logic said they should give up. Lisa Carter watched the battle reports from New Boston and 17 other colonies under attack. The pattern was the same everywhere. Humans refused to surrender despite being outnumbered and outgunned. They were losing battles but making victory so expensive that the Deari advance was slowing down. The Admiral realized that Jake Morrison's single word had started something that would spread far beyond Earth. Humanity had chosen to fight rather than submit, and that choice was costing their enemies more than anyone expected. The galaxy was about to learn that some species would rather die than accept slavery. The real war was just beginning. The news from human space spread through galactic communication networks like wildfire racing across dry grasslands. Captain Roy Barnes sat in his cargo ship docked at Kepler Station when the first reports arrived through the merchant channels. He had been trading with humans for 2 years and thought he understood them reasonably well. Roy was wrong about everything he believed. He knew about humanity. The footage coming from New Boston Colony showed scenes that defied everything the galaxy understood about civilized behavior. Humans were fighting building by building against an enemy that possessed superior technology and overwhelming numbers. Instead of negotiating surrender terms like any rational species would do, they seemed to prefer dying in place rather than accepting defeat. Roy activated his ship's communication array and began broadcasting the combat footage across every channel available to merchant vessels. Within hours, the images reached trading posts and colonies throughout this sector of the galaxy. The reaction was immediate and profound. On the research station orbiting Ilari Prime, Dr. Helen Ross watched the broadcasts with her alien colleagues gathered around her laboratory's main display screen. Helen had spent 3 years working with the Ilari as part of a cultural exchange program designed to improve relations between species. The peaceful aliens communicated through patterns of bioluminescent light that covered their jellyfish-like bodies, the Ilari researcher named. Glow of understanding dimmed to almost complete darkness as the human combat footage continued playing. Helen recognized this as a sign of deep respect among her colleagues. The alien was honoring human sacrifice in the way her people showed appreciation for noble actions. "Your species fights differently than we expected," Glow of Understanding said through the translation device. "When faced with superior force, most civilizations seek accommodation. Humans seem to prefer resistance even when victory appears impossible." Helen nodded while studying the tactical displays that showed human defensive positions throughout New Boston. The colony had been designed to look like a simple farming community, but every building served multiple purposes. Schools became medical stations, barns transformed into weapons depots. Even playgrounds had been built with defensive positions that children could use if necessary. "My people have a long history of fighting against impossible odds," Helen explained to her alien colleagues. "We have learned that surrender often leads to slavery or death anyway. When faced with those choices, humans prefer to die fighting rather than live as prisoners." The Xanthari Council convened an emergency session on their homeworld as reports continued arriving from the war zone. Elder Xanthara stood before the assembled representatives while holographic displays showed battle damage from 17 different human colonies under attack. The Elder's crystalline body flickered with patterns that indicated extreme confusion. The Xanthari had maintained galactic peace for over 2,000 years through careful negotiation and diplomatic compromise. They had never encountered a species that simply refused to negotiate when faced with annihilation. The humans appear to lack understanding of proper surrender protocols, Elder Xanthara announced to the council chamber. Ambassador Morrison's response to Overlord Krex was not negotiation or counterproposal. It was complete rejection of Deari authority. The younger Xanthari representative Crystal Song of Dawn created light patterns that translated as urgent concern. "Perhaps we misunderstood their cultural context. Most species eventually accept terms that allow survival even under unfavorable conditions." Elder Xanthara's form shifted to deep blue patterns that indicated serious contemplation. The reports suggest that humans view death as preferable to subjugation. This represents a fundamental difference in basic survival instincts that we did not anticipate. On Deari Prime, Overlord Krex studied battle reports that made no sense according to everything his species understood about conquest. The Deari had perfected the art of warfare through campaigns against dozens of different civilizations. They knew exactly how much pressure was required to break enemy resistance and force surrender. Humans were not following the established patterns that governed civilized warfare. The reports from New Boston showed that human defenders continued fighting even when their positions became untenable. Soldiers with fatal wounds used their remaining time to set explosives that would damage Deari forces. Civilians chose to destroy valuable infrastructure rather than allow it to be captured intact. Krex activated communication links to his fleet commanders throughout human space. The reports were similar from every battlefront. Human colonies were falling, but the cost in Deari casualties and equipment was far higher than any previous campaign. Commander Sharktooth of Victory appeared on the holographic display with his armor scorched and damaged from close combat. His report was brief but troubling. Overlord, the humans fight like cornered animals. They use tactics that result in their own destruction but maximize damage to our forces. Victory is possible but expensive. Krex studied casualty figures that showed losses exceeding all previous campaigns combined. The Deari Empire had built its power through quick victories that demonstrated overwhelming superiority. Extended warfare against determined resistance was not part of their strategy. The Kalfari philosopher May Ashton had lived among humans for 6 months as part of a research project, studying comparative psychology between species. She floated in her environmental suit before the emergency session of the Galactic Council, while representatives from 12 different worlds waited for her analysis. May had studied human history and culture more thoroughly than any other non-human in the galaxy. Her report would influence how the Council responded to the current crisis between humans and the Deari Empire. Council members, May began, her melodic voice carrying clearly through the translation systems. The word spoken by Ambassador Morrison represents more than simple defiance. For humans, refusing to surrender is a fundamental expression of their identity as a species. The Vex representative made rapid clicking sounds that translated as mathematical calculations. Analysis indicates human resistance patterns deviate from optimal survival strategies by significant margins. This suggests irrational decision-making processes. May's tentacles moved in patterns that indicated patient disagreement. What appears irrational from our perspective represents core human values that transcend individual survival. They would rather die as free beings than live as slaves. This principle has shaped their entire civilization. The council chamber fell silent as representatives contemplated the implications of May's analysis. If humans truly preferred death to submission, then traditional diplomatic solutions would be impossible. The war could only end with complete victory for one side or total destruction of both civilizations. Trading guilds throughout the galaxy began adjusting their policies as news of human resistance continued spreading. Species that had maintained neutrality in galactic conflicts started reconsidering their positions. The sight of humans fighting impossible odds against overwhelming force was inspiring reactions that no one had anticipated. The galaxy was learning that the word no could be more powerful than any weapon when spoken by people who meant it completely. 8 months had passed since Jake Morrison spoke the word that changed everything. The Deari War had spread across human space like a disease that consumed entire star systems. Colonel Pete Morgan crouched in the ventilation shaft of a Deari supply depot watching enemy soldiers move cargo containers filled with weapons and ammunition. Pete's special operations team had been conducting sabotage missions behind enemy lines for 6 months. Their orders were simple but almost impossible to execute successfully. Make the war so expensive that the Deari Empire would collapse under the financial burden of trying to conquer humanity. The strategy was working better than anyone had dared to hope. Every human colony that fell required weeks of fighting that cost the Deari enormous amounts of equipment and trained soldiers. Supply lines stretched across multiple star systems, were constantly under attack by human raiders who appeared from nowhere and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Pete watched through his scope as Deari workers loaded ammunition onto transport ships bound for the front lines. His team had planted explosives throughout the facility during the previous night. The detonation would destroy enough military supplies to delay the next offensive by several weeks. The colonel activated his communicator and whispered the attack signal to his team members positioned around the depot. The explosions began exactly on schedule with flames and debris filling the air as months of accumulated supplies burned in secondary detonations that continued for hours. The Galactic Council reconvened an emergency session on a space station far from the war zone. Representatives from 12 different species gathered to debate the crisis that was threatening to destabilize their entire region of the galaxy. The chamber buzzed with translation fields and nervous energy as delegates argued about courses of action. Elder Xanthara stood before the assembly with crystalline patterns that indicated deep concern about recent developments. Intelligence reports showed that the Domari Empire was losing ships and soldiers faster than they could be replaced. The economic strain of fighting humans was affecting their ability to maintain control over previously conquered territories. The situation has exceeded all predictions, Elder Xanthara announced to the gathered representatives. Domari forces control significant human territory, but at costs that threaten the stability of their empire. Meanwhile, human resistance continues to intensify rather than weakening over time. The Vex delegate made rapid calculations before responding with mechanical precision. Mathematical analysis indicates current casualty ratios are unsustainable. For Domari military doctrine, probability of empire collapse within 18 months approaches 67%. The Ilari representative glowed with soft patterns that indicated cautious optimism. Their species had secretly been providing medical supplies to human colonies through neutral trading vessels. The sight of humans dying for freedom had inspired even peaceful species to take sides in the conflict. Commander Sue Blake infiltrated the Domari Communication Center on the captured mining world of Kepler-7. Her mission was to intercept enemy transmissions that might reveal their next strategic move. What she discovered was far worse than anyone had imagined. Sue crouched behind computer terminals, while Domari technicians worked at their stations just meters away. Her translation device decoded their conversations in real time as she recorded everything for later analysis by intelligence specialists back on Earth. The conversation she overheard made her blood run cold with fear and rage. The Domari High Command was planning to use their planet-killer weapon against Earth itself. The massive device could crack a world's crust and turn entire continents into molten lava within hours. The human homeworld must be destroyed completely. One technician was saying to his colleague, "Conventional conquest has proven too expensive. Total annihilation will send a message to other species about the price of resistance." Sue realized that the war had reached a turning point that would determine the survival of human civilization. The Domari were admitting that they could not afford to continue fighting humans using traditional methods. Genocide was their solution to the economic problem that human resistance had created. She transmitted the intercepted intelligence to Earth using encrypted channels that would take days to reach Admiral Carter. The message was brief but contained information that would force the Galactic Council to finally choose sides in a conflict they had tried to ignore. The Xanthari Council debated the revelation about Domari plans for Earth's destruction. Elder Xanthara's crystalline form flickered with patterns that indicated moral outrage at the concept of planetary annihilation. Even species that had remained neutral throughout the war could not ignore the implications of genocide. The use of planet-killer weapons violates every treaty that governs civilized warfare, Crystal Song of Dawn announced to the emergency session. If we allow this precedent, no world will be safe from species that choose conquest over coexistence. The debate continued for hours as representatives argued about military intervention versus continued neutrality. The Kelfari spoke of moral obligations to protect innocent civilians. The Vex calculated the long-term consequences of allowing genocide to succeed. Even the traditionally isolationist species began discussing the need for action. Young Counselor Ben Tucker had arrived from the Terran diplomatic mission just hours before the session began. He carried a message from the human government that had been prepared for exactly this situation. The words were simple, but their meaning would echo through galactic history. Ben stood before the assembled representatives with the confidence of someone who represented a species that had already chosen their path regardless of the consequences. His voice was steady as he delivered humanity's final statement to the galaxy. "Honored delegates," Ben said while looking directly at each alien representative in turn, "humanity does not ask for your military assistance or advanced weapons. We do not request sanctuary on your worlds or safe passage through your territories. We will continue to resist Deari aggression with or without galactic support." The chamber fell completely silent as Ben paused to let his words sink in before continuing with the most important part of his message. "What we ask is simple. Decide what kind of galaxy you want to live in. One where might makes right and genocide is acceptable, or one where freedom has value and species can choose their own destiny. Humanity has already made our choice. The word is still no." The Galactic Council faced the decision that would define their civilization for generations. Stand with the species that refused to surrender, or watch as tyranny consumed everything they claimed to value. The vote would determine whether Jake Morrison's simple word had the power to unite free species against oppression. The galaxy held its breath waiting for the answer. The Deari fleet emerged from hyperspace above Earth like a dark storm cloud that blocked out the stars. Admiral Lisa Carter stood on the bridge of the flagship UES Constitution watching enemy ships take positions around humanity's homeworld. The planet-killer weapon hung in the center of their formation like a mechanical moon designed for destruction. Lisa had known this moment would come ever since Sue Blake's intelligence report reached Earth 3 weeks ago. The Deari had committed their entire remaining fleet to this final assault. Either they would destroy humanity completely, or their empire would collapse under the weight of their own ambition. What the Deari did not expect was the sight that greeted them as they prepared for bombardment. Ships from 6 different species had joined the human defense fleet in orbit around Earth. Xanthari crystal vessels reflected sunlight like prisms. Alari bioships pulsed with organic light. Even the mathematical Vex had sent their geometric warships to stand beside humanity. The Galactic Council had voted to intervene after Ben Tucker's speech. The decision was not unanimous, but it was decisive. Species that had maintained neutrality for centuries chose to risk everything rather than watch genocide succeed. Jake Morrison's simple word had inspired others to make the same choice. Captain Amy Foster commanded the small ship that carried the most important mission in human history. Her crew included volunteers from 3 different species who had chosen to sacrifice their lives to prevent Earth's destruction. The Xanthari engineer Crystal Heart of Courage worked alongside human technicians. The Ilari navigator Gentle Current of Hope guided them through enemy formations. Amy's ship was too small to show up on Deari sensors as anything more than space debris. Her team had studied the planet-killer weapon for weeks, looking for weaknesses in its massive structure. They found what they needed, but reaching it would require flying directly into the heart of the enemy fleet. The battle began when Overlord Krex transmitted his final ultimatum to the combined fleet defending Earth. His message was the same one the Deari had used to conquer 47 different worlds. Surrender or face total annihilation, no negotiation. No compromise. Admiral Carter responded with words that Jake Morrison had made famous throughout the galaxy. "Our answer remains the same. No, we will not surrender. Come and take what you can." The space battle that followed was the largest in galactic history. Energy weapons lit up the darkness between ships as fighters and bombers launched attacks that created explosions visible from Earth's surface. The Deari had superior numbers, but their enemies fought with the desperation of species defending everything they valued. Human ships used ramming attacks when their weapons failed. Xanthari vessels formed protective shields around damaged allies. The Ilari coordinated medical evacuations while Vex ships calculated optimal attack patterns. Species that had never fought together before were working as a unified force. Amy Foster's ship approached the planet killer through the chaos of battle. The massive weapon was charging its primary systems while smaller Deari vessels provided escort protection. Getting close enough to plant explosives would require flying through defensive fire that could vaporize her ship in seconds. Crystal Heart of Courage worked frantically at the engineering station while energy blasts shook the small vessel. The Xanthari engineer had modified human explosives with crystalline technology that would create a chain reaction throughout the weapon's power core. The detonation would be visible across multiple star systems. Gentle Current of Hope guided them through the enemy formation using navigation skills that her species had developed over millions of years. The Ilari could sense gravitational currents and energy patterns that allowed them to find safe paths through seemingly impossible situations. Amy pushed her ship's engines beyond safe limits as they approached the planet killer's docking bay. Deari fighters were closing in from all directions, but her crew had accepted that this was a one-way mission from the beginning. They would succeed or humanity would die with them. The small ship crashed through the weapon's defensive barriers and landed inside the main power chamber. Amy's team had exactly 10 minutes to plant the explosives before the planet killer fired on Earth. They ran through corridors filled with Deari guards while carrying equipment that would destroy the entire structure. Crystal Heart of Courage reached the power core first and began attaching crystalline charges to critical systems. Gentle Current of Hope provided cover fire while Amy worked to override security systems that could stop their sabotage mission. Human determination combined with alien expertise in a desperate race against time, the explosions began deep inside the planet killer as Amy's team completed their mission. The chain reaction spread through the massive weapon faster than anyone had calculated. The detonation tore through the Deari fleet's formation and sent shockwaves across the battlefield. That damaged ships on both sides. Admiral Carter watched the enemy fleet break apart as their ultimate weapon destroyed itself. Without the planet killer, the Deari had no way to force Earth's surrender. Their conventional forces were already exhausted from months of fighting humans who refused to give up. The battle ended when Overlord Krex's flagship was surrounded by ships from 4 different species working together. The Deari leader found himself facing the same choice he had offered to countless others: surrender or die. Jake Morrison walked into the prison cell where Overlord Krex waited for his war crimes trial. The Deari leader still could not understand how his empire had been defeated by species he considered weak and divided. His cybernetic implants sparked with damaged circuits as he stared at the human ambassador. "Your word destroyed everything we built," Krex said with a voice full of rage and confusion. "How does one small word defeat an empire that conquered 47 worlds?" Jake sat down across from his former enemy and spoke with the patience of someone explaining simple truth to a child. "You never understood what that word meant. When humans say no, we mean it completely. We would rather die than submit to tyranny. What you did not expect was that other species would learn to make the same choice." The Galactic Council voted unanimously to establish the Morrison doctrine as the foundation of their new alliance. No species had the right to dominate another. Every civilization could choose their own path. The word no was now protected as a fundamental right throughout the galaxy. Jake Morrison returned to the council chamber, where his journey had begun. As he took his seat among representatives of free worlds, he realized that his simple word had become the foundation of galactic freedom. The galaxy had learned to fear not humanity's weapons but their refusal to accept the unacceptable. The word no had changed everything.